I want to start tonight by slowing you down for just a moment because if you skimmed the headlines this week, you probably thought you understood what happened. An Australian infrastructure firm opened an office in Toronto. That sounds technical, boring, the kind of business news you scroll past. But what actually happened here is not small, and it is not routine. It is one of those quiet decisions that tells you far more about where power is moving than any speech or tariff threat ever could. You saw the news, but you did not see the signal inside it. That is what we are going to unpack together. On the surface, the story is framed as confidence. Canada attracted foreign investment. Toronto remains competitive. Another international firm chose Bay Street over somewhere else. The coverage treats this like a feather in Canada's cap and little more. But if that is all you take away, you miss the deeper reality. This decision was made in a political environment defined by instability, threats, and economic coercion coming from Washington. And the fact that one of the world's most conservative patient infrastructure investors chose Canada anyway tells us something uncomfortable about where capital now believes safety and profitability live. What officially happened is simple. IFM Investors, Australia's largest infrastructure fund manager, announced the opening of a Toronto office and a major expansion of its Canadian operations. This is not a speculative venture capital shop chasing the next app. This is a fund owned by pension plans. Its job is to protect retirement incomes over decades, not quarters. When that kind of institution commits staff, capital, and long-term planning capacity to a country, it is making a judgment call about stability, policy, and trustworthiness that will shape investment flows for a generation. Now ask yourself why that judgment was made. Now, the standard explanation is that Canada has good infrastructure opportunities. That is true, but it is incomplete. Canada has had ports, energy systems, and transit needs for decades. What changed is not the existence of projects. What changed is the global perception of risk. Under Trump's second administration, tariffs are not bargaining chips anymore. They are instruments of discipline. Allies are treated as dependencies to be managed rather than partners to be cultivated. For global capital that depends on predictability, that is poison. This is where Mark Carney's strategy matters. From the moment he took office, he made a bet that Washington openly dismissed. Build infrastructure independence, reduce reliance on American markets, attract patient capital that values stability over leverage. The financial press laughed because they are trained to think that serious money must pass through New York. But capital does not care about mythology. It cares about risk-adjusted returns. And when the United States turns economic relationships into hostage negotiations, capital looks for exits. IFM did not come to Toronto to make a statement against America. That is a lazy narrative. They came because Canada offered something increasingly rare in the global economy, a rules-based environment where infrastructure can be built without wondering if the ground will shift under your feet every election cycle. This is not ideological, it is actuarial. Pension funds think in decades because their beneficiaries live in decades. They cannot afford chaos. Look at the pattern inside IFM's existing Canadian investments and you see the logic clearly. Ports, energy systems, heating networks, logistics. These are assets that only make sense if you believe a country will remain functional, solvent, and politically coherent for a very long time. You do not put money into these assets if you expect trade wars, regulatory whiplash, or sudden policy reversals designed to score domestic political points. The deeper story here is not that Canada won a beauty contest. It is that the United States is quietly losing one. Not because of decline in talent or resources, but because of a deliberate strategy that treats economic power as something you wield through threats instead of trust. When capital moves, it does not announce its motives in moral language. It simply goes where it feels safer. And tonight, that verdict is unmistakable. If you want to understand how global power actually shifts, stop watching the shouting and start watching the spreadsheets. This Toronto office is one of those moments that will look obvious in hindsight. And if you are wondering why infrastructure in the United States keeps crumbling while capital quietly builds elsewhere, this is where the answer begins. What makes this moment so revealing is not the size of the announcement itself, but the kind of investor making it. IFM is not chasing momentum. It is not trying to arbitrage headlines or exploit short-term dislocations. Its ownership structure tells you everything you need to know. This is capital that belongs to working people's retirement funds, teachers, transit workers, nurses, engineers. Their money is managed with one overriding mandate: do not lose it and make it last. That mandate produces a very specific worldview. Stability matters more than speed. Governance matters more than hype. Predictability beats bravado every time. So when IFM's leadership explains that Canada's infrastructure policy environment supported their decision, you should hear what they are really saying. They are saying that Canadian public institutions still function in a way that long-term investors can model. They are saying that regulatory processes, while imperfect, are legible. They are saying that partnership with public actors is possible without constant fear of political retaliation. That may sound basic. It used to be assumed. It no longer is. Contrast that with what infrastructure investors face in the United States right now. Tariffs announced by tweet, trade rules rewritten as punishment, allies publicly humiliated to signal strength to a domestic audience. For investors whose assets must operate for 30 or 40 years, this is not toughness, it is risk. And risk, when multiplied across supply chains and financing structures, raises costs in ways that no tax cut can offset. This is where the surface media framing completely fails you. Coverage treats this story as a vote of confidence in Toronto, but the real question is not why Canada looks attractive. The real question is why America suddenly does not. And that answer sits at the intersection of politics and capital in a way we rarely talk about, honestly. Economic power is not just about size. It is about credibility. When a government demonstrates that it is willing to weaponize interdependence, every rational actor begins to plan for independence. IFM's expansion plans make this dynamic visible. They are not just maintaining existing Canadian assets. They are building operational capacity, hiring professionals, embedding themselves locally. That only makes sense if you expect deal flow to grow, not shrink. It means they see pipelines of projects in energy, transport, digital infrastructure, and social assets that will require sustained engagement. In other words, they believe Canada is entering an infrastructure build-out phase that will last years, not months. And here is the part that should make you uncomfortable if you live in the United States. Capital did not wait for America to collapse. It simply found a better option. That is how power erodes in real life. Not through dramatic exits, but through quiet reallocations. One office here, one partnership there, one hiring plan shifted north instead of south. Over time, the cumulative effect is enormous. You can already see how this plays out in everyday terms. When infrastructure capital goes elsewhere, domestic projects get delayed. Maintenance gets deferred, costs rise, workers face layoffs or stagnating wages. Communities watch bridges age, grids strain, and transit systems fall behind. Meanwhile, the places that attract patient capital build quietly, steadily, and with compounding returns. This is not abstract. It shapes commute times, utility bills, housing costs, and job security. What IFM's decision exposes is a deeper truth about capitalism that rarely makes it into political debate. Capital is not loyal. It does not care about flags or slogans. It responds to incentives and risk environments created by policy choices. When leaders confuse intimidation with strength, they do not discipline capital, they scare it away. And that brings us back to Carney's bet. He did not promise dominance, he promised reliability, he did not threaten partners, he invited them. That sounds modest, even dull, but in a global economy saturated with volatility, dull is powerful. Dull attracts the kind of money that rebuilds economies from the ground up. So the next time you hear that tariffs make America strong, ask yourself this: strong for whom and for how long? Because somewhere in a Toronto office tower tonight, planners are mapping out projects that will shape North America's infrastructure for decades, and they are doing it on the assumption that the future is being built north of the border, not south of it. To really understand why this shift matters, you have to look at what kind of capitalism infrastructure investors practice, because it is very different from the version most people encounter in headlines. This is not about buying low and selling high. It is about owning assets that become part of daily life and stay there. Ports do not relocate, power grids do not pivot, data centers and transit systems are embedded in geography and law. Once capital commits to them, it is locked in alongside the public. That creates a relationship that is as political as it is financial. In Canada right now, that relationship is being structured around partnership rather than extraction. Pension funds, public agencies, and long term investors co own assets. Risk is shared, returns are steady rather than explosive. This model does not produce billionaires overnight, which is one reason it receives so little attention, but it does produce something far more valuable over time. Systems that work, and systems that work attract more capital of the same kind. This is where Trump's approach reveals its deepest flaw. By treating economic relationships as contests to be won, it ignores how modern infrastructure finance actually functions. You cannot bully capital into building a port that takes 15 years to pay off. You cannot threaten an energy investor into committing billions if policy may reverse on a whim. Coercion works in short-term transactions. It fails in long-term systems. When IFM talks about partnering with domestic investors, that language matters. It signals respect for local governance and shared priorities. It means decisions are made with an understanding of regional needs rather than distant financial engineering. Compare that to the American pattern of privatization followed by fee extraction, cost cutting, and eventual public bailout. Investors like IFM know the difference. They have watched it play out repeatedly. The consequences show up in places most people never connect to capital flows. Reliable transit means workers can get to jobs on time. Stable energy systems mean predictable utility bills. Modern ports mean exporters are competitive and supply chains are resilient. When infrastructure works, it disappears into the background of daily life. When it fails, everything else becomes harder. That is why patient capital is so powerful. It shapes the invisible architecture of ordinary existence. Media narratives rarely ask why this kind of capital is moving. Instead, they focus on personalities, slogans, and political theater. They ask whether leaders look strong rather than whether their policies reduce risk. They frame tariffs as toughness without measuring their downstream effects on investment decisions made quietly in boardrooms around the world. The missing question is always the same. What behavior does this system reward? Right now, the system rewards governments that offer predictability, respect contracts, and treat economic partners as collaborators. It punishes governments that generate uncertainty to signal dominance. That punishment does not arrive as a press release, it arrives as an absence. Projects not funded, offices not opened, jobs not created. Over time, those absences accumulate into decline that feels mysterious and inevitable, even though it was produced by very specific choices. What you are seeing in Canada is not a rejection of America as a society or a culture. It is a rejection of a governing style that confuses disruption with leverage. Capital is not ideological, but it is extremely sensitive to governance quality. When governance deteriorates, capital leaves without drama. That is what makes this moment so instructive. There is no crash, no panic, just a steady redirection. If you want to know where an economy is headed, stop listening to campaign speeches and start watching where long-term investors place their people. Offices mean commitment. Hiring means expectation. Infrastructure means belief in continuity. IFM's presence in Toronto is not about today's news cycle. It is about the next 30 years. And that raises a question worth sitting with. If the most conservative capital in the world is planning for a future built on cooperation rather than coercion, what does that say about the path being chosen elsewhere? And more importantly, who will pay the price if that warning continues to be ignored? There is another layer to this story that rarely gets discussed because it forces us to confront how power actually works in advanced economies. Infrastructure is not just concrete and steel, it is leverage. Whoever finances it shapes how a society moves, heats itself, communicates, and grows. For decades, the United States exercised that leverage not by building better systems, but by positioning itself as the unavoidable financial intermediary. Capital flowed through American markets because there was no credible alternative at scale. What Carney understood and what Washington dismissed is that intermediaries only retain power as long as they are trusted. Once trust erodes, scale becomes less valuable. In fact, it becomes a liability. If every transaction carries political risk, investors begin to ask why they should route capital through a system that actively destabilizes itself. Canada's move has been to quietly offer a parallel path, not a confrontation, an option. This is why sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, and infrastructure specialists are paying attention. These institutions are not driven by nationalism, they are driven by fiduciary duty. Their managers are legally obligated to seek stable returns for beneficiaries who will retire decades from now. That obligation makes them allergic to unpredictability. When American policy signals that agreements are provisional and alliance is conditional, those managers start planning around the United States instead of through it. You can see the consequences of this divergence already. In Canada, infrastructure planning is being framed as nation building. In the United States, it is framed as a partisan bargaining chip. One approach treats public investment as a foundation, the other treats it as a talking point. Investors notice, they always do, and they respond accordingly. What makes this especially consequential is that infrastructure investment has multiplier effects that compound over time. Every port expansion supports exporters. Every energy upgrade stabilizes industrial costs. Every data center strengthens digital sovereignty. These are not isolated gains. They reinforce one another. That is how countries quietly leap ahead while others stagnate despite greater nominal wealth. Meanwhile, American workers are told that tariffs will bring jobs back, but jobs depend on systems. Factories require reliable power. Logistics require modern transport. Digital services require data infrastructure. When capital that builds these systems chooses to go elsewhere, the promise of reshoring becomes hollow. You cannot will industrial revival into existence while undermining the conditions that make investment possible. This is where class comes back into the picture. The costs of this strategy do not fall on those who announce it. They fall on workers whose communities lose investment, on households paying more for energy because grids are outdated, on commuters losing hours because transit systems decay, on younger generations inheriting crumbling infrastructure and mounting public debt. Meanwhile, those with mobile capital insulate themselves by moving it to safer jurisdictions. The tragedy is that none of this is inevitable. It is the product of policy choices that prioritize dominance over durability. Canada's approach is not perfect, but it recognizes a basic truth. Economic sovereignty in the 21st century does not come from shouting the loudest. It comes from building systems others want to participate in. So when you hear that another foreign institution has chosen Toronto, do not treat it as flattery. Treat it as data. It is a signal about where global capital believes the rules will hold. And rules, not rhetoric, are what sustain economies over time. The question that lingers is not whether Canada can attract this kind of investment. It clearly can. The real question is whether the United States is willing to change course before the slow leak becomes a structural drain. Because once infrastructure capital commits elsewhere, it does not come back easily. It builds roots, it builds relationships, and it reshapes the economic map in ways that are very hard to reverse. At this point, it helps to step back and see the pattern as a whole because IFM's move is not an outlier. It is a data point in a broader reallocation that is happening quietly across North America. European firms choosing Toronto over New York for regional headquarters. Asian investors looking to Vancouver instead of Seattle. Manufacturers exploring Canadian facilities, not because labor is cheaper, but because trade exposure is more predictable. Each decision on its own seems manageable. Together, they amount to a slow but decisive shift in where long-term bets are being placed. What makes this especially striking is that none of this required Canada to outcompete the United States on raw scale. Canada did not suddenly become larger, richer, or more technologically advanced. What changed was the perceived reliability of the governing environment. Capital does not need perfection, it needs consistency. It needs to know that contracts signed today will not be treated as political leverage tomorrow. When that expectation breaks down, even the most dominant economy begins to leak advantage. The media struggles to cover this because it does not fit the preferred narrative of drama and confrontation. There is no villain monologue, no single moment of collapse, just a series of rational decisions made by institutions that cannot afford to gamble with the future. That makes the story harder to tell, but no less important. In fact, it makes it more dangerous to ignore. For ordinary people, the effects of this shift will not show up overnight. They will appear gradually. Slower infrastructure upgrades, higher maintenance costs, more frequent system failures, governments scrambling to fill funding gaps as private capital looks elsewhere. And eventually, political leaders will ask why rebuilding costs so much more than it used to. The answer will be that the cheapest capital left when it stopped feeling welcome. This is the deeper lesson about capitalism that moments like this expose. Markets are not neutral forces floating above politics. They are shaped by policy choices, institutional trust, and power dynamics. When leaders choose confrontation as a governing style, markets respond by minimizing exposure. When leaders choose cooperation, markets respond by committing long-term resources. These responses are not ideological judgments. They are survival strategies. IFM's decision to expand in Canada is in this sense a verdict, not on patriotism, on governance. It reflects a belief that Canada will remain a place where infrastructure can be planned, financed, and operated without constant political sabotage. That belief is now being monetized in real time. What should make you uneasy is how little this is discussed in American political debate. Tariffs are debated endlessly. Infrastructure is invoked rhetorically, but the connection between trust, capital, and long-term economic health is rarely made explicit. And so policies are judged by how aggressive they sound rather than by how they shape investment behavior years down the line. If there is a warning embedded in this story, it is this: you cannot threaten your way to prosperity. You cannot bully capital into building the future you neglected. You have to create conditions that make long-term investment feel boring, safe, and worthwhile. That is what Canada is doing right now, imperfectly, but deliberately. And that is why institutions like IFM are showing up with patience instead of promises.